Good morning to all you out there who are joining us on this beautiful Sunday for our Father's House video service. I don't have very much to say today, but it is Mission Sunday, so if you would like to give to our mission in Argentina or India, you can do that online. You go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button. You can give a one-time gift, set it up as a recurring gift. I know Pastor Juan over there really appreciates it. They had a vacation Bible study for the kids last week, and they had over 30 kids come. So they are just being blessed, and they are blessing us by being part of our congregation. You can also give your regular tithes and offerings online at the Father's House. Again, we appreciate everything that you are giving, but please know that we're probably running about $5,000 in the red every month. So anything you can give is greatly appreciated. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the area and you'd like us to come by and pick up your tithe, we'd be more than willing to do that. We get to see Cal and Margie on a regular basis because that's how we're doing their tithe. And again, we appreciate all that you give. Men's meeting is still meeting on Monday nights on Zoom at 6:30. They're going through the book of Romans. If you want to be part of that, let Pastor Carl or Pastor Carlos know, and they'll get you hooked up on that. The ladies group finished up our Bible study on Thursday nights on our Zoom meeting, so we're actually going to take a break for a few weeks. We'll pick something back up in the first part of July. I'll be letting you all know about that. And we would love to have anybody join us. I think the new study we're going to be doing is on characters in the Bible. So if you want to be a part of that, let Deanna or I know. We'd love to have you join us and be a part of that. So we've been going through the book of Mark, and we've had a special guest speaker each week. I hope you've appreciated that. I know I am really enjoying this study. So we'll turn the time over now to our special guest, John Mark.
Well, good morning again, Father's House. I'm glad to be back with you again. I see Philo brought his friends as well, so I guess we'll continue where we left off last week when we were talking about the life of Jesus. I hope you've enjoyed what I've been talking about since we've been talking about his story and his life. Again, my name is Mark. Basically, my name is John Mark, but I go by the name of Mark. And you can find me, and I'm probably best referenced in the Bible, in the book of Mark, which is the Gospel of Mark that you can find concerning the life of Jesus. Yes, it's true. I was an eyewitness there. I was there when Jesus was alive. I saw many of the things that he did, most of the things that he did, although there were some things I obviously would have missed. There were many things that I did see. And I'm here today, like I've been for the last several weeks, to kind of talk to you about this person, Jesus Christ, how he changed my life, how he changed others' lives, and basically just to convince you that surely he was the Son of God. Everything I'm talking about today points to that fact, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So with that, let's talk a little bit more about Jesus and what he did, who he was, the way that he taught, and maybe I can convince you that he was the Son of God, so that you too can participate in this life, this beautiful life, that he now offers us through his death, his burial, and his resurrection, and his ascension to heaven, where he sits at the right hand of God. But we'll talk more about that. Maybe not all of that, but some of it. So last week we kind of talked about Jesus, and we talked about how his miracles had begun to grow. That what we saw with the healing of a leper, the forgiving of sins, and then with that, the healing of the paralytic, where he says, rise up and walk, dealing with people with mental illness and being troubled in their spirit, called it demon possession or demonized. And yet there's this part of this mental illness that they were really dealing with and settling their mind to some extent. But in dealing with that, moving forward, there's some other things that I want to talk about as we saw his miracles grow. We saw where he stilled the storm, and the disciples were astonished that he did that. And then there was the leper we talked about. The man that was demonized on the other side of the Sea of Galilee that was gashing himself with rocks. Jesus healed him and then sent him on his way back to his people to have him tell them the good things that God had done for him. Coming back to the other side, over by Capernaum, where his hometown was at that time, there was a member of the synagogue, Jairus, and his daughter was taken ill, and Jesus, after she passed away, resuscitated her from the dead. And that's where we left off yesterday, with these big, big miracles that Jesus did. And I said his miracles were beginning to grow. I want to tell you that that continued, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in the next couple of minutes. But before that, I think I probably want to tell you the next story that might relate to the idea of belief in God, believing in God, and why our faith in God is important. So Jesus, after raising Jairus' daughter from the dead, he returned back to his hometown, not where he was living currently, but the place where he was raised as a child, the town of Nazareth. So Jesus returned to Nazareth, and the people of Nazareth, they knew Jesus well. I mean, after all, he'd grown up there. I mean, there was nothing really in their eyes that was special about Jesus. Oh, sure, they'd heard about what he was doing in other regions, and many of them had gone out to see him and what he was doing. But there was also this part where he was common to them. He was common because he was one of their folk. And so Jesus came home, and while he was in Nazareth, he went into the temple to teach one day. And when he went into the temple, he began to teach, and the people that were born and raised with him, they began to question Jesus. And they kind of thought, well, who is this Jesus anyway? Said, who is it that gave him this wisdom of God? And how is it that he does all these miracles, which probably aren't happening? And basically what was happening is there was this level in them of unbelief, and there was this level that they were offended by who Jesus Christ was and what it was that he was saying. Now, Jesus' message didn't change. His message to his own people wasn't any different than his message to others. I guess the sad part about that event in Nazareth was that his family was there. His brothers and his sisters, maybe they were given to peer pressure, but they sided with the townspeople to some extent against Jesus. Now, Jesus caught that. He caught the way that they were acting, and he caught their attitude and what they were saying in the pews where they were sitting. And he looked at him and he made a very profound statement. He said, a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown. What he was saying to his people, is he was saying, anywhere else I go, I'm being received by people for who I am, the Son of God. But I come to you, the very people that should know me the best, and you're offended at me, and you're offended at what it is that I'm doing. Now, maybe it's that you're jealous of me. Maybe it's because you don't believe that God could use anybody out of Nazareth. Whatever the case might be, it is true. I am a carpenter's son. It is true that I'm one of the common people that's here. But that doesn't mean that God didn't have a destiny for me that you don't understand. Because I want to tell you something. He does. Now, a very interesting thing happened there. Because wherever Jesus went, and whenever Jesus went elsewhere, there were these profound miracles that happened. And as they happened, no matter where he went, no matter what he said, there were people that were thronging to touch him, longing for him to touch him, longing for him to heal them when they came to him. And Jesus did that. Yet Jesus also knew there that he had to restrict what it was that he did because of their unbelief. It's not that Jesus didn't have the power. It's just that they didn't provide the vehicle of faith and belief that caused them to be able to experience the healing touch of Jesus the way that others had done. I think that becomes a big problem in all of our lives. It becomes a problem when we find ourselves offended by something God does, offended by what God may reveal to us, offended by the way that God might present himself that we don't like. And so what happens is we find even in our own self, it's easy for us, isn't it, to lack faith or to not believe. So because of that, Jesus could only heal just a few people there. It was there, and the reason is because they lacked something, not because he lacked something. It's kind of this principle. There's principles that we live by in life. Let me give an example out of a natural principle. If I was to stand up right now and I had a rock that was this big. If I took that rock and I held it over my foot and I said, well, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. If I drop this rock on my foot, it's not going to hurt. And I took that rock and I dropped it on my foot. What do you think would happen? That big boulder is going to fall down. It's going to hit me right on my toes and break my toes, and it's going to hurt. Why? Well, all of us would say, well, that's pretty simple. It's because of the law of gravity. Because of the gravitational pull of the planet, what happens is that rock's going to fall, and because it weighs 35 pounds, when it hits your toes, it's going to hurt. And it does. There's a law there, the law of gravity. It's a principle. It works all the time. It's what keeps us rooted on the planet, I guess would be a good way to put it. Well, if it's true that physical laws exist, don't you think it's true that immaterial and spiritual laws can exist as well? And that when you break a physical law, you know that you're going to break your toes. But when you ignore or you break a spiritual law that you might not see, it means that there's a repercussion for that. And in this case, what happened? Because they chose not to believe. In other words, and because they chose to turn their back on God, as opposed to turning towards God, it was limited what Jesus was able to do. It's not that he didn't have the power, it's that they didn't want it. And they rejected it, and they were offended by it. Well, needless to say, Jesus, looking out at the crowd after healing only a few of his friends and family that was there, he was astonished at their unbelief. But I can tell you something, it didn't keep him from doing what it was that he's supposed to do. You see, Jesus knew what his calling was. And he knew that the things that he wanted to do in life and the things that God had called him to do, that it wasn't in people's hands that he would leave his destiny. In other words, their peer pressure wasn't going to affect him. So Jesus left Nazareth, and he kept doing the things that he always did. Well, Jesus also, though, at this time knew that the things that he could do and the people that he could touch, that it would be limited because it was only wherever he went. So let's say he was in Capernaum, where he lived. Well, he could heal people in Capernaum, and it's true that a lot of people came to him. But there were also other people that couldn't make it to where Jesus was, that still needed healing. So Jesus did a very interesting thing. Now, you know that his disciples have been walking with him for quite a while at this time. They were familiar with his teachings and the ways that he had done things. And so Jesus said, I want to send the 12 of you out on a mission. I want you to go to the surrounding cities, and this is what I want you to do. Number one, I don't want you to take any provisions. I don't want you to take bread. I don't want you to take extra clothing. I want you to take what you have on your back and your staff, and I want you to go. And whatever city you go into, if somebody will receive you in that city and give you a place to lodge, stay with them and don't leave that place. And in that city that I send you to, this is what I want you to do. I want you to teach the people or proclaim to the people the need for repentance. And then I want you to do the exact same things that I've been doing. I want you to heal the sick, lay hands on the sick and heal the sick. And I want you to heal those that are mentally ill, or what I would call casting out demons. And so he sent them out, and that's exactly what they did. They did exactly what Jesus told them to do. Now, I guess the question would be well, why did Jesus do that? And I think that it kind of ties back into the idea that what it was that God wanted to do wouldn't be just through Jesus alone, but it would be through those that followed him, those that believed in him, trusted in him, and walked with him in a committed discipleship. So with that, then, he left the people doing that. And while they were doing that, there was another part of the story of Jesus that's kind of off to the side, but I think it's probably worth mentioning now. And I'll bring it back into play a little bit later after we talk about it now in the life of Jesus in future weeks. So remember when John the Baptist who was the one that introduced Jesus at the very beginning when we first started talking. And then I said that John the Baptist had died, that he had been beheaded. Well, he was beheaded by a man by the name of Herod, and they called Herod a king, but he really wasn't a king, not the king of Rome, but he was a tetrarchy. He ruled over the region. But he was so popular, they just called him the king. Well, anyway, he had married his brother's wife, stole her from him. And so remember that John the Baptist, the reason that he got in trouble with Herod is because he called Herodias, his wife, that used to be his brother's wife, and him out for what it is that they had done and the brutality in which they had done it. Needless to say, because of that, what happened was an incident happened where John the Baptist's head was required by somebody, and in the household of Herod. I won't go into it much. But anyway, at that time, Herod beheaded John the Baptist and presented his head on a platter to Herodias, which was his new wife's daughter, or his stepdaughter. Long story, but I won't go into it today. But what happened was, after killing John the Baptist, and because he was really intrigued by John the Baptist, he didn't really think much of it. He just thought, well, I just killed a holy man. But then he began to hear these stories about Jesus. And when he began to hear these stories about Jesus, he was inquisitive as to who this Jesus Christ was. Now, some people said, well, he's John the Baptist, risen from the dead, which you can imagine, that really, I don't know, I guess it upset Herod to think that this very guy that he had killed had come back in the person of Jesus Christ. Others said that he was a prophet Elijah. Others said that he was just a prophet. But no matter what the case was, there was this question as to who Jesus was. But in the back of Herod's mind, Herod believed it was John the Baptist who had risen from the dead. The reason I bring up that story is because in the life of Jesus, he wasn't growing in popularity, good and bad popularity, because you can be popular in a good way and popular in a bad way. He wasn't just growing in popularity with the people that he was touching and healing and that were listening to him teach and preach, but he was also growing in popularity with other people that weren't so fond of Jesus. One of them would ultimately be Herod. In other words, Jesus' ministry of what he was doing with the people were beginning to affect politically the climate which Herod was the authority over. So this will come back up later because this is going to be part of the betrayal of Jesus and ultimately the reason for his death. But remember and keep in the back of your mind that Herod now and the idea of governments or the Roman government is starting to become very uncomfortable with Jesus. The same way that we saw earlier that the scribes and Pharisees were becoming uncomfortable with Jesus. The same way that we see in Nazareth, his own brothers and sisters and his own people, the town of Nazareth, stood against him. They didn't believe. And so now we leave Jesus come back to Jesus after leaving Nazareth and after sending out the disciples and understanding there's this political thing that's beginning to happen with the Roman government that's ultimately setting up the future for what's going to happen in Jesus' life. Now it could look that would be very grim. But at the end of the day, I have to tell you, it was all a part of God's plan. For Jesus, for me, and for you, and all of humanity and creation. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. Well, I could stop there, but there's probably a few stories that might help us understand a little bit better about the idea of how it was that Jesus was growing in magnitude. So the disciples come back from the journey that Jesus has sent them on. And as he comes back, they come back, and while they're there, Jesus can tell now that they're a little bit tired, like he's been a little bit tired, because they've been out ministering and people have given them no rest. Now, I've talked about this from the beginning. It seems like from the very first moment that Jesus started his ministry, there was a constant flow of people. It was very, very rare that he had gotten rest. Well, the disciples, coming back from their short missionary journey, they were exhausted. So Jesus decides he's going to take them to a quiet place so that they can rest, decompress, and they can also just kind of talk about the things that happened because they were excited. Because as they proclaimed the message of repentance and they healed people, there was this power of God that came through them that excited them. I need to say that that word repentance can be taken in a negative context, but it's really not. You see, the word repentance just simply means turn towards God. See, people were, like in Nazareth, they were turned away from God, and repentance is turning towards God in this context. So they were telling people, turn towards God, and as you turn towards God, He has the ability to heal you and to set you free in your mind. Anyway, they came back. Jesus decides that He wants to take them and get some rest for them, and probably needing rest for Himself. So they get into a boat, and Jesus intends to go across the sea to a quiet area that He knows. But the people, as I said, they don't want to let Jesus go. So they see Jesus going across the Sea of Galilee, and they know that He's going somewhere. And so on the shore, they began to follow where it is that He is going. As He gets to the other side, where He wants to spend some quiet time with His disciples, the people are already there when He gets there. Well, what's Jesus going to do? Now, I guess He could turn the people away and say He's tired and not do it today. But that was just never Jesus' custom. It's not His style. So Jesus, as the people were kind of gathered around Him, He found this beautiful little amphitheater where He could talk. And He sat down and He began to talk with the people. And the people just kept coming and coming and coming. First, it started off with a handful. Oh, well, maybe more than a handful, maybe 100, 150. The next thing you know, it had grown to over 1,000. And they just kept coming. And pretty soon, there was about 5,000 men, along with their women and children. Huge group, huge. I mean, I've never seen anything like that before. Well, Jesus taught for a while. He healed. He did what He always did. And while He was doing that, the people just didn't want to leave. But it was getting late. Now, we're not in any city. We're out in a remote area. There's no lodging for the people. There's no place for people to get anything to eat. They're just there. But they don't want to leave. Well, as it starts to get late in the day, just before the sunset, His disciples came to Him and said, Lord, it's getting late, and these guys need some rest, and they need some provisions, so why don't we close this thing down for the day, and you can send them to the villages, and they can eat, and they can get lodged, and they can get cleaned up, and then they can come back tomorrow, and we'll continue this campaign tomorrow. Well, I don't think that Jesus was looking for an administrator in His ministry or for His ministry. So He looked at His disciples and He said, no, they don't need to go anywhere. You give them something to eat. And they look and say, well, we've got a little bit of money, but we don't have enough money to feed 5,000 people plus the women and kids. What are we going to do here, Jesus? And Jesus looked at them and said, well, let's do this. How many loaves do you have? He said, well, we've got 5 loaves of bread. How many fish? He said, well, we've got 2 fish. So Jesus says, get those 5 loaves of bread and bring them to me along with the 2 fish. So they go and get them. And as they get the loaves of bread and the 2 fish, He takes them before Him and He prays over them. And after giving thanks, He takes the loaves and He breaks them off and gives them to the 12. Actually, the 10. And He took the 2 fish and He gave it to the other 2. And He said, now, I want you to go and start feeding the people. And I want to tell you, it was like those fish and loaves, they just multiplied. They would break the bread and break the bread and break the bread. And as they did that, there was just more bread and more bread. And pretty soon, everybody had bread. And they took the fish and they broke off pieces of the fish because it was already cooked. And they would give people pieces of the fish and they would eat and they would eat and they would eat. And at the end of the day, there was all this food that was there that started with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And they were all fed. And after they were fed, Jesus looking out and seeing that everybody was satisfied, he said to his disciples, take these baskets and go and collect the remaining food. As they went out and they collected the food, lo and behold, every one of them came back with a basket full of food. You see, it wasn't that Jesus was able to just provide the means barely. He was able to provide his means for people abundantly. Now, this becomes important because sometimes our belief limits us in what we can get. Going back to Nazareth, if you think about it going back there, that it was their lack of belief that limited them. And you see, it was the disciples' lack of belief in this instance that limited them too. Jesus sent them away. And Jesus said, you don't need to send them away. Just start with what you have. And as you continue, I want to tell you something that the rest will be provided. Well, after that, the disciples, all of us, me included, sitting there with Jesus, I didn't get it. I didn't understand it. So Jesus decided it was time to send the people away, so he sent the people away. When he sent the people away, he told his disciples to go across the water and go to the other side, and that he would meet them there, back near their hometown of Capernaum. When he did that, he said goodbye to the people, and he went up into the mountain to pray. Well, that night, as Jesus was praying, and the disciples were headed back to their home, what happened was a wind came up that was against the boat again. Second time. We just talked about it earlier. That was the first time. Now that time, Jesus was in the boat, and he calmed the sea. Well, this time Jesus was praying, and he looked out, and he could see them on the water, even though it was way late into the night, because there was a full moon out. And he could see them struggling in the boat. And so he decided it was time for him to go across to the other side and to meet his disciples, where he promised to meet them across the sea. But Jesus did the most profound thing. He didn't go around on dry land. He walked on the water. He walked right across the water, and it was the most dumbfounded thing I'd ever seen. As he's walking on the water, I can tell you, he's walking right by us in the boats. And as he's walking by, he doesn't even care that there's wind and waves. It doesn't even seem to be bothering him. As a matter of fact, he's so frustrated by our lack of unbelief that he's intending to walk right by us. Well, I have to tell you something. I don't know about you, but I've never seen a man walk on water, and neither have the other disciples. The next thing you know, everybody's screaming out and crying and whining and carrying on because they're afraid, because they think they've seen a ghost. And Jesus looks at his disciples in the boat. He comes up to it. He says, don't be afraid. It's me. And he gets in the boat and stills the storm, and they go to the other side. Now, I have to tell you something. Jesus was very frustrated. He was frustrated by his disciples. You see, it was one thing for the townspeople to not believe. I mean, they knew Jesus as a little boy and growing up. I understand that they understood that. But as disciples, they knew Jesus differently. And that's why he was frustrated. Well, how so? Well, differently because remember when Jesus sent them out on a mission? He said, don't take anything and God will provide. God provided. They come back and tell him about it. And then when the people are needing something from God, they say, send the people away. And God says, if I supplied, or if God supplied for you when you were on your journey, what makes you think God won't supply for them here and now? You give them something to eat. You take care of them, because that's your responsibility now. Well, they didn't know what to do. So they said, well, Jesus, we're here. And Jesus said, fine, I'll do it. Take the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and began to serve the people. And all were fed. And so Jesus, knowing that when they were on the water, going across the other side, Jesus knew that their unbelief was the thing that was stopping them from understanding who he was, what he came to do, and what God had in store for them in their future. So what's the payoff for us? Well, the payoff for us is, as we think about it today, is how much is our unbelief stopping God from doing miracles in our life? How much? How many times do we find ourselves complaining, wondering, whining, and listening to bad news? And in all the things we listen to, it only hinders our faith. How many of us find that we're offended by God and offended by Jesus when he does something for somebody else and not for us? But how many times have we had a hard heart over the times we've seen God make provisions for us when we didn't have anything? The times that we were very down and despondent and God came through for us. And at the end of the day, I guess that the moral of the story of what Jesus was trying to convey in the midst of that was the fact that if you have nothing more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, you can feed 5,000 men and their family if you begin to break the bread and break the fish. It doesn't have to be big to start. It has to be your little bit. And when you bring your little bit to God, and you begin to use that little bit to serve others, God has a way of multiplying. God has a way, through that process, of adding to your little bit to where everybody has enough. It comes down to this. It comes down to the spiritual law, not the physical law, of giving and receiving. And as you give out, God will give back to you. The question today is, do you believe this? The question today is, will you bring your 5 loaves and 2 fish, the way the disciples did, and let God multiply it for others? Not for you, for others. And when you do that, and everybody's fed, I promise you, you'll have a basket left for yourself. I hope this spoke to you a little bit about who Jesus was, and the power of the Son of God, and what his message was. And the only thing I can say is, if you say yes to God, if you turn towards God, you believe that he can do it, and you leave it in his hands, he'll take your little bit and turn it into plenty for all. Well, God bless you. Have a great day. We'll talk more about it next week. Thank you.